Hey guys, so one quick announcement and one note about this podcast before we begin. So Lester Godsey is the Chief Information Officer for Maricopa County in Arizona. And prior to that, he served as the Chief Information Security Officer for Maricopa County. And previous to that, he was the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Mesa in Arizona. We talk about a couple different topics, including security surrounding the Super Bowl and Waste Management Open, which were hosted on the same weekend here in Arizona, and it was crazy how many people were in town that weekend. We also talk about election security, which it's important to note that Maricopa County was thrusted into the political spotlight, at least here in the U.S., and we generally try to keep a pretty objective and neutral stance when it comes to politics, which can occasionally come up in cybersecurity, whether it's partisan politics and probably more often geopolitics. And I think one of the things that separates great podcasts is the ability to talk to people from a wide variety of backgrounds, as well as the ability to talk to people who have differing opinions that could be on either side of the political spectrum. Also important, we are now available on all major podcast platforms, so Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, as well as many of the other ones. And without further ado, we hope you enjoy. Hey Lester, so thanks so much for joining the podcast. So we recently just had the Waste Management Open and Super Bowl here on the same weekend. What was it like being the CISO of a county hosting two of those pretty large events?
Interestingly enough, from my perspective, it was pretty nominal. So Maricopa County was involved, and from a cybersecurity oversight perspective, we were one of multiple agencies, both from a governmental as well as private sector, that were participatory in that, right? And so the interesting thing is we saw a lot more cyber activity collectively, that group I should say, saw a lot more cyber activity the week leading up to the Super Bowl than the actual day of. So matter of fact, day of, from all the reports we got, things were unusually quiet for a Sunday. But leading up to that, we did see some concerted attacks from a cyber perspective. And interestingly enough, we saw them in the local government realm, but then also the NFL getting hit with the same attempted attack. So we have a high degree of confidence that it was the same threat actor or group that was attempting that. But in terms of the waste management specifically, we didn't see any credible threats along those lines. But part of what we're seeing and what cyber, in my experience, is getting more involved with is not only cyber activities, but because we have that awareness and we're already doing the threat hunting and intelligence gathering, that we're seeing ourselves getting a little bit more involved in kinetic or physical threats as well too.
So why do you think it was the week up to it? Do you think they were just kind of doing some recon, or were they trying to do like DDoS attacks, or?
Yeah, so again, I'm very cautious when I answer these sort of questions, because as a government agency, we don't have access, and even if we did, it's not our position to do basically attribution, if you will, right? So, but with that being said, my theory is that the group or individuals, again, we can't ascertain that, we're trying to get a sense and maybe kind of poking and prodding with regards to what the cyber preparedness was along those lines. And so for anybody out there listening to this that has aspirations to interrupt the next Super Bowl activity, I would warn them that this is not intended to be a challenge, but organizations take this sort of stuff very seriously, because really at the end of the day, all the people that came in the state of Arizona to enjoy the Super Bowl and the activities leading up to that, we're very concerned about those sort of events and the potential risk associated with them. And so as a region, I can tell you, we had probably over 30 different agencies ranging from government, law enforcement, to businesses that represented critical sectors, right? Like transportation, manufacturing, et cetera, all involved in actively monitoring and making sure that those activities from a cybersecurity perspective were safe, and as well as all the other aspects of managing and ensuring the safety of an event of that magnitude. So obviously law enforcement, emergency management, transportation, infrastructure, the whole nine yards. So cybersecurity was just one aspect of that, right?
So you mentioned physical security as well. One of the new hot topics for sort of the cybersecurity side of things is drone security. Has the county done anything to sort of address some of the problems that we're facing around drone security with these big events?
Um, so the county is starting to put controls and compensating controls, I should say, into place as it relates to those sort of things. We're not targeting drones specifically, but the mechanisms behind that, right? So whether it's security-centric IT asset management, improved security controls around wireless communications, which obviously drones take advantage of. And then, from an IoT perspective, honestly, drones are just another flavor of IoT, if you will. So we are doing things along those lines. I will tell you that in preparation for the Super Bowl, there was a working group specifically around drones themselves.
Oh, that's
So,
awesome.
yeah, no, and it's awesome and it's super scary at the same time, right? Because again, this doesn't involve Maricopa County whatsoever, but look at the Russian-Ukraine, challenges over there and the war, basically. And you've seen reports in the news about how drones are being leveraged along those lines as well. So that threat is very real, very credible, and so that's something that we as an organization and with events like that, you can't afford to ignore, right? Because it's just becoming more and more commonplace.
So how do you think? So now before you were the CISO of Mesa, which is a city in Arizona for some of the people watching. Um, how does that differ from being the CISO of a city to being a CISO of a county? Excuse me, county.
Yeah, so for your listeners that maybe are less familiar with the area, so size and scale in this instance does matter to a certain degree. Mesa is the third large, or at least at one point was the third largest city in the state of Arizona. So the population being just a smidge over 500,000, I believe. And then by population, Maricopa County is the fourth largest, which we have, I believe, over 3.5 or 4.5 million residents. And so scale does play a role, but the bigger difference is the nature of the services provided by a city versus that of, say, a county, right? And so really it's kind of more of an apples and oranges. So I'll give you a good example. So City of Mesa, one of the things that I spent a fair amount of time with was quote unquote traditional SCADA systems, in particular the various different utilities that City of Mesa has. So they have water, they have gas. I think they might be the only city in the state of Arizona with an electrical utility still. And so everybody else gets their electricity from either SRP or APS, right, here in the state of Arizona for the most part. And so I don't have those same services within Maricopa County. But I traded all that for elections. So that's been the one. And so, we have elections here. We have both organizations have transportation, but it's of a different nature and scale, if you will, along those lines. And also the other big difference is we have public health as well as correctional health and all those other sort of things. So the jails, which, City of Mesa has their own small jails, but it's nowhere in comparison, right? And then the whole public health thing. So when COVID-19 hit, the level of involvement that the county had from a regional perspective was obviously, a lot different as opposed to like City of Mesa, which is not directly responsible for health services. Obviously, they want to provide municipal services, but they're not on the hook for that. They don't maintain or run a series of hospitals or things of that sort. So it's kind of more just apples and oranges depending on the nature of the service in question.
So kind of jump back to Super Bowl. Because I know you mentioned that Maricopa has about 4.5 million people, which it seemed like during the Super Bowl, I don't know the stat, but I imagine the size, or at least the amount of people in Maricopa probably doubled in that Super Bowl weekend. I mean, I've never seen so many people just convert on a city before like that. How do you handle that big of an influx in that short of a time?
Well, so, Yeah, and really, I can only speak from a cybersecurity perspective, but I guess anecdotally is, I can speak in working with the other departments that maybe have more skin in the game as it relates to logistics, infrastructure, transportation, right? That sort of thing. That, this is not the first time that the state of Arizona has hosted the Super Bowl or any other large event like the, Final Four for college basketball, or, any sort of NASCAR event or any other sort of big event, including, other debates and things of that sort. So I think the region as a whole has plenty of experience in logistics, right? And also enacting, whether it's in the form of an emergency operations center to help manage day of events and things of that sort. So the region as a whole has a lot of experience along those lines. I will also tell you that I can say this definitively, that from specific to your question about the number of bodies and the amount of travel and all that other stuff, all of transportation, there's a mutual, for lack of a better description, there's a mutual sharing of information amongst agencies. So for example, Maricopa County Department of Transportation shares traffic data with the adjacent municipalities throughout the region. And so there's infrastructure, which I'm not going to go into detail because that'd be inappropriate to share, but there is infrastructure in place to disseminate traffic camera, traffic data across multiple agencies across the board. So we can coordinate. We share that at the state level, and it goes down to the counties, and it also goes down to the municipalities as well. So we can coordinate and have a clear understanding of where the challenges are, where the bottlenecks are, if we're seeing an inordinate amount of traffic, pun intended, right, at any given location along those lines, and quickly coordinate with respect to that. So, I will say, I think we, generally speaking, not that there's not challenges, but I would say generally speaking, we're pretty good at that sort of thing. If for no other reason, we have plenty of practice based off of other events, previous Super Bowl that we've hosted, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Because I was going to ask, what about the internet and cellular infrastructure? Was there any concern about that being overwhelmed with so many people, especially when they were kind of concentrated right by the Waste Management Open or Phoenix Open, or the Super Bowl?
Yeah. So there are, and it's a matter of perspective as to what those concerns are and who has them, right? And so, keeping in mind, there's a difference between the venue, the person who owns the venue or is responsible for the venue, versus from an emergency management perspective. So, case in point, I know that at the Waste Management Open as well as the Super Bowl, the venue owners, so those the golf course and the stadium respectively, had reached out to the local cell providers to provide temporary additional coverage from a cellular coverage perspective, right? And then your question is perfectly in line with those sort of things that we on the emergency management and public safety side of things are concerned about, right? So, and I'm not saying that FirstNet was actively involved per se, but this is the reason why efforts like FirstNet, which is that dedicated public safety cellular network, exists in the first place. And so I'll give you a different example, not from the Super Bowl, but from my previous job at the City of Mesa. So when President Trump first came and was running for president, he had a stop in Mesa. And so I could tell you in that instance that Verizon had come in, they had provided additional capacity there, not only for the attendees for the event, but also to ensure that there was adequate cellular coverage for public safety that was there, trying to provide police services along those lines. So those things I can guarantee are always accommodated, both from a venue and customer user perspective, as well as public safety and the overall response and security for the event itself. So, and the other thing to keep in mind too, when you're talking about public safety, that's another reason why, amongst many, that public safety folks, whether we're talking about fire, police, or other related services, will use radio network communications that aren't necessarily dependent on cellular coverage as well. So they cover their bases. They have a multitude of different options available to them. If there's problems with one, they always have a fallback. And so that's pretty consistent, and it's always been the case.
So let's jump a little bit into elections. I think that's a major thing that counties do. So I know that in 2020, you previously mentioned that there were some threats to the election around, I think, denial of service. Can you touch a little bit on that and kind of what the difference you saw in 2020 and then 2021 and how you kind of take steps to mitigate those threats?
So yeah, just to clarify, so it's really more the difference between 2020 and 2022, right? So
did I say 2021?
21, that's fine. So, really it was interesting. I think when I talked to you earlier, the way I would categorize the difference is in 2020, from a pure cybersecurity threat playbook, like if there was a playbook out there of all the different types of attacks you could see, in 2020 we virtually saw all of them, versus in 2022 we really didn't see almost any of them. And so what I mean by that is, so in 2020, we literally, no exaggeration, we saw DDoS attacks against Maricopa County. We saw a vendor supply chain based attack against a third party that we leveraged, and they'll remain nameless. We saw a data scraping attack against one of our websites. And again, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we don't do attribution. We don't have the intelligence to do so. And even if we did, it would not be our place to do so. But I can tell you, based off of conversations with our federal partners, we have a high degree of confidence. We saw attacks from nation states, advanced persistent threat actors, as well as hacktivists and everything in between. And then, of course, we saw the dismiss and malinformation attacks, as well as kinetic physical threats. People being threatened online, people calling our call center, and et cetera, doing all that. That was all 2020. And then really in 2022, what we saw was really the mis, dis, and malinformation based campaigns against us. And then, as well advertised in the news, we saw individuals and groups that were camping out, watching ballot boxes, stuff like that. But really the vast majority, or the impetus of those threats in 2022 really stem from the mis, dis, and malinformation, primarily from the social media platforms, whereas we saw more of a buffet of different types of attacks in 2020.
Why do you feel that shift happened on the cyber side of things?
That's a darn good question. And again, speculation on my part, but put yourself in the shoes of the adversary or the hackers or or the threat actors, right? I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of what your motivation is, you want to get to the desired result as quickly and as efficiently as possible, right? So in my mind, what is going to be the most so this assumes your motivation is to disrupt the elections and the cast doubt and create as much chaos as possible, right? So let's just make that assumption for a minute. If that's your motivation, then what's the path of least resistance? How can you accomplish what your goal is with the least amount of effort? And in my mind, if that's what is really the case and what is motivating you, then taking the approach of using social media to spread mis, dis, and malinformation is the path of least resistance. All that other stuff requires a certain amount of technical acumen, a certain amount of resources, like a DDoS attack, right? Now, granted, there's DDoS as a service type of services out there on the dark web, right? But those aren't free. They cost money. It requires you to know where to go, So if you're not somebody who delves in the dark web, or even know how to get on the dark web, right? I mean, it requires a certain amount of knowledge. To spread mis, dis, and malinformation just requires you to have an account on one of the social media platforms and to package your post in a way that's tantalizing and would encourage, reposting and sharing, right? So a good example of that was back during I think it was post 2020, but in relation to the 2020 election cycle, we had somebody who probably just thought it was important information to share, right? So it was more the misinformation campaign. But this individual had shared an image of where our Dominion equipment was kept, right? And it was an image of, basically it's in a room that has 4 clear walls, and we have a web camera on there, so that way we can be transparent about, who has access to it and it's coming and going. The recorder set it up that way for purposes of being, just to try to be transparent. Well, the image that they shared had a piece of paper that was taped on the wall, supposedly, that said router username and password on it, right? We used third-party software to demonstrate and prove that image was altered, and that portion was added to the original image. And so did that person know that? Were they the ones who did that? Probably not, right? So they legitimately thought that was real, and they wanted to share with their audience, And so whoever did that original post did that intentionally, right? We can obviously. And, that probably didn't require a lot of skill or expertise, and they shared that on social media, and it just grew legs, right? So if I'm the bad guy, why wouldn't I do that, right? As opposed to try to teach myself how to hack, how to do this, or find somebody who has those technical skills in order to launch a data scraping attack or a DDoS attack. So I think it's just a certain amount of economics and path of least resistance is my theory as to why we saw a shift in tactics.
So it's interesting you brought up the kind of the verification system, which I think is going to become quite a bit more important, especially as AI really starts to take off. Because how do you differentiate between, I guess, like someone in the U.S. who's posting their opinions where it's protected First Amendment right versus like a Russian troll farm that's coming out of some other country? It's not someone who's an individual. Because I see that all the time on like YouTube. Like on the shorts, you'll see something that seems like super pro-Russia. And it's like, is this somebody in the U.S. or is this just like some foreign intelligence agency, likely Russia, posting this on YouTube?
Yeah, and I mean, look, at the end of the day, from my perspective, whether there's a message or something that's being shared, whether it's coming from a U.S. citizen within the United States or outside the United States, it's not our job to do any sort of censorship by any stretch of the imagination, right? So, and really what it comes down to, but there is a difference between censorship versus somebody who's willfully and maliciously sharing inaccurate information. And so, and again, in that context, it doesn't matter whether they're in the United States or not, right? And so I'll give an example that my team had shared with me before I started working at Maricopa County. So I want to say it was during either the 2016 or 2018 election cycle. And so somebody had posted on Twitter that a polling location was shut down and not to show up. That was blatantly false, and so because the polling station was up and people were going there to vote. And so that was a situation where then the county reported that to the local fusion center, which is the ACTIC here in the state of Arizona. And then they reached out to their federal partners who had personnel located in key locations. In this case, they had somebody, I think, from the FBI at Twitter. And so then within an hour period, they were able to take that post down, that sort of thing, because that was obviously wholly incorrect. So that wasn't an issue of a censorship, right, where we're censoring somebody's opinion, that are protected by the Constitution. That was just somebody who's being a knucklehead trying to discourage people from voting, right, whereas there's obviously that wasn't the case. And so that's a real battle, though, to your point, that we're trying to fight against. And I would say that and again, my opinion, this is just my personal opinion. It's not a official stance of Maricopa County, but I kind of miss the old days of the newspaper, to be honest with you, because if for no other reason, there's journalistic standards that are in place. If you were interfacing with the newspaper and a reporter, that there would be an expectation and assumption that they're going to do fact checking if they do determine that something was incorrectly shared through their medium, that they would then issue a retraction, et cetera, et cetera. There were just certain things you could assume. And so where I'm going with this with social media, it's interesting. There was a Pew Research study done a number of years ago that said somewhere in the ballpark, I want to say either 61% or more Americans at the time of the research use social media as a source of news, which is very interesting because the model for social media is not journalistic by default. It's intended to make money. And so the algorithm literally is designed to reward additional eyeballs, right? And so, which doesn't necessarily translate to news. I do think that social media could do a lot more by way of, to your earlier point, addressing Russian trolls or other nation state, based social media traffic, if you will, along those lines. We don't have the resources, we don't have the insight, and in large part, it's not for us to police the internet, right? Certainly, we don't want to be accused as a government agency of anything that would even sniff of censorship, because we're all about, the Constitution and ensuring, just like during the 2020 elections or 2022 elections, for those people who wanted to protest, as long as they did so peacefully, that's their right to do so. And we encourage that, right? And so it's really kind of slippery slope, and so the stance we take from a cybersecurity perspective is, look, you're entitled to those activities to share your opinion online and whatever means that you want. But at the same time, we try to the best of our ability to ensure that we are keeping tabs on what's being said, how it's being shared, because that oftentimes has a direct correlation to an elevated level of cyber and or kinetic or physical risk.
Yeah, it's definitely a fine line to walk with a slippery slope on it. Over this podcast, we're trying not to get into politics because I'm sure we have viewers on both sides. And as far as the elections go, I've heard people mention blockchain as a potential use case for elections, which I think we've seen some, questioning of the authenticity of the vote. So we've had kind of the voter ID laws and signature verification to authenticate votes, as well as we've seen some questioning of the legitimacy of the elections from both sides, which I think it's very difficult. Because I guess when you vote, you kind of just vote and kind of forget about it, to be honest. Which outside of having a professional company audit an election, which is expensive and still not exactly for the average person really meaningful. Do you think that kind of with all that blockchain could potentially solve some of those problems? I know blockchain is not like the silver bullet and answer for everything, but do you think it could address some of those?
So I'm going to answer this question with two different mindsets. One from a pure technology perspective. So in that context, I do. Now, with that being said, a couple things specific to Maricopa County. The votes are tabulated electronically, but when you actually cast your vote, it's paper. So a lot of people forgot that, especially during the 2020 elections, right, where they were accusing us of altering the votes electronically. I'm like, it's printed out, man. We don't manipulate paper, although I've seen those conspiracies as well. So, but to your point, for those agencies that do go to pure electronic or have gone to pure electronic voting, I think blockchain is very promising along those lines, right? And so just the inherent nature of how blockchain works, I think lends itself towards that. It could be used. Now, from a more practical, real world, that's maybe not the right characterization. From my current perspective, having lived through a couple of these election cycles, I think blockchain would actually be worse for us than not. And the reason why I say that is because I've come to realize that you can try to be as transparent and logical as possible with regards to trying, specific to the topic of elections, to be able to say, look, here's the steps we've taken. We've documented this. I know that the election director at Maricopa County has offered and has held multiple tours of our election facilities, and has gone through literally the process from beginning to end about how votes are collected, things leading up to the day of election, early voting, the whole 9 yards, all the way to tabulation, and how ultimately the results are calculated, right, and how they're reported. I've participated in those, and so we've done all those sort of things, and yet we still have people who are casting doubt and aspersions about the process itself. I legitimately think that if we as Maricopa County would try to interject blockchain technology and move towards electronic voting, that actually would have the adverse impact, and I think that would cause even more doubt in a process that I think is already rife with a lot of people who question it to begin with. Because now, if for whatever reason, people, if they could touch a piece of paper, at least that's something, right? And so when you then translate that into something that's digital, even if it's supposedly immutable, kind of like what blockchain purports to be, right? It's a digital ledger of sorts, right? And you can't make a modification unless all parties who participate in that blockchain agree to that, right? So the logic from a technology perspective, all three of us understand that, right? And we're like, yeah, that makes sense, blah, blah, blah. But I'm telling you, as soon as we take that and we do electronic voting, it's just everybody's going to be, well, here's proof. They're just trying to make it easier, to manipulate and modify the vote and blah, blah, blah. So I think the technology is promising, and I think it definitely could potentially be leveraged. And again, I'm not a blockchain expert, but then from a practical perception perspective, I think it falls down, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess there probably, because I think the major reason like most blockchain is pretty well trusted is because it's decentralized, but there probably would be some legal hurdles to having a decentralized election.
Oh, and I haven't even talked about the legal challenges. I've just, the court of public perception, man. I mean, seriously, I think that's, as soon as you say we're not going to do any more paper ballots, I think that's when everybody's just kind of would be like, what's going on, And, blockchain is not necessarily for the faint of heart. I mean, somebody who is not technical in nature, I think there's somewhat of a curve to get over in terms of explaining why it's decentralized and how it's actually very secure, blah, 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 so.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess we're all three probably more technically proficient, I'd like to think, than the average person. I always assumed that with like the paper ballots, that was done because if you went electric, you'd be potentially inviting in like you kind of mentioned the DDoS attacks and different cyber threats. So it sounds like there are counties that are already doing electric. Have they had a lot of issues with cyber threats?
So that's interesting. And again, I don't know. Let's put it this way. I haven't heard of any county in Arizona that's doing electronic voting. I do know there's other jurisdictions in other states that have. I have personally yet to hear any issues about that, in terms of electronic voting. And again, I'm not an expert in that, especially since I've had not to personally deal with it. But I gotta guess that if anybody was doing electronic voting, it would definitely not be on any sort of enterprise or any sort of open network by any stretch of the imagination, right? I mean, like the Dominion system that is leased by the recorder's office, right, just to do the tabulation, is not connected to the enterprise network whatsoever. I can tell you that for a fact. And that's been audited. And so I can't envision any sort of electronic voting that's used in production that would be, right? That would just be inviting a disaster, to say the least. So.
Okay, that makes sense. I knew you'd also mentioned blockchain for threat intelligence, as far as like authenticating threat intelligence. Can you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I know you and I briefly talked about this. And so I think I think another potential use case of blockchain is the sharing of threat intelligence, in particular amongst multiple disparate agencies, regardless of what sector you're in. And so currently right now, I think one of the things collectively as a nation that it'd be nice to see a more concerted effort on is effort around public-private partnerships. So sharing of threat intelligence between the public sector versus private sector. So regardless of what sector you belong to, so government, financial, manufacturing, entertainment, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. Threats are threats, right? And so the more intelligence that we can get, the better off we are. And so whether we want just to have overall awareness, or if we want to automate certain actions from a security control perspective, then we're that much more secure, right? The real kicker part of that is A, the quality of the threat intelligence that you're receiving, and B, the confidence that you have on the intelligence, whether it's from a validity of the data itself, or that whoever is sharing the intelligence with you is who you expect it to be. And that's where blockchain can come into place, right? So, because if you have a system or a network that's used specifically to disseminate threat intelligence and share that with a wide audience, that's obviously a promising potential target by a threat actor, right? And so how can you ensure that the only people that are contributing to that threat intelligence are people that should be contributing, right? And so that's where I think blockchain has a potentially interesting use case to it, right? So, because if I really wanted to, drop something in the punch bowl, so to speak, that'd be a way I would do it, right? I would drop some intelligence in there that would either best case scenario, maybe redirect somebody to look somewhere else as opposed to where the real threat was, all the way to we do a certain amount of automation along those lines. So the few sources that we really trust, we actually automate the ingestion of those IOCs, and then we automatically blacklist them on our firewall, for example. So 10 minutes upon receipt of an IOC that we trust, we'll actually add that to our firewall and just block temporarily, right? And so if the threat actors know that organizations like mine are doing stuff like that, they're going to throw bad IOCs to things that are legitimate, that are going to disrupt our activities. And now all of a sudden, if I'm blocking access to, one of my critical enterprise applications, then I've harmed the organization as a result. So I think that's where blockchain might have some potential value.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know, especially with AI, who's been talking about kind of like data poisoning, where just even a small amount of data could potentially throw off an entire algorithm, or at least just whitelist a specific threat as it comes through. So now we're a little bit over on time here. So I got to ask about TikTok. I know I've asked Tim Romer and some other people, which I think now is especially interesting is we're starting to see the talk about banning it as a country, which I know a lot of states have banned it with at least with their employees, at least on either on the managed devices or maybe it's a condition of employment. So what are your thoughts on TikTok? And is that really something that could even be plausible to ban it nationally? Because I don't know how you would enforce that.
I guess my opinion about TikTok, so just for the record, I don't have a TikTok account. That's just not my thing, right? But so this kind of goes back to an earlier statement I made about attribution. And so, look, all I can do is make the best decisions from an organizational perspective based off of the intelligence that I receive, right? So when it comes to credible threats, I'm going to lean upon our federal partners to share whether or not that is a credible threat. So if they're saying that TikTok is a threat vector from a nation state perspective, then I'm inclined to follow suit along those lines. Now, with that being said, so we've had conversations internally about that. We're evaluating our position as a county with regards to use of TikTok. But obviously that's within the purview that we have as an organization. Having the nation do that is interesting. I mean, from a technology perspective, I'm sure there's obviously ways to make that happen, but how practical are they? That's an entirely different set of questions, right? So from my perspective, that's kind of my opinion. If the federal government and the agencies with the resources to know better and are ultimately responsible for our security at that level are suggesting that that's a threat vector, I'm inclined to agree along those lines, because I have to make the best decision based off of the information provided to me. So that's really kind of where my head's at on that now. If all the 18 to 30-year-olds out there throw hate my way, well, I guess it is what it is. But yeah, that's kind of just where I'm at. So
Yeah, I mean, it seems like kind of like almost like questioning our intelligence. Like we're willing to give up all this privacy to a not so friendly nation state for a couple dancing videos.
yeah, well, I mean, again, as a government agency, we take individuals' rights very seriously, and via the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So from a privacy perspective, my stance on I have a 20-year-old nephew, right, who I guarantee doesn't think about privacy, right? That's his prerogative, and that's his right, right? That's his right to be ignorant about privacy, is the way I look at it. But as a cybersecurity professional, I feel like it's my job to afford him the option to care or not about his privacy from a security controls perspective. If he elects to ignore that, that's his prerogative, but at least to the extent I can, and all the constituents in Maricopa County, I want to do my best to try to afford them that opportunity to decide whether or not they want to trust something or share information. And I think as cybersecurity professionals, I would like to think that most of us feel something similar along those lines, right?
Yeah, definitely. So thanks so much for coming on. This was awesome. If people want to follow you for more information and more insights, where's the best spot to find you? Or maybe you don't.
Yeah, so funny. So we were talking about social media, right? So the only social media I do is LinkedIn. So that's the only place you can find me. But I'm somewhat active on there. But again, that kind of fits my needs. And but yeah, so you can follow me. Just Google me at Lester Godsey, and you'll find my LinkedIn profile. So.